Hello and good morning and good evening and good day, wherever you are from. Good afternoon. We are so glad that you are here. We have been trying to have this conversation and discussion for months because whenever Em and I get together, we completely dive into this discussion and talk about how much what we're going to talk about aligns and makes such an impact. So we're going to go ahead and I'm going to let Emma go ahead and introduce herself and share about her, and then I'm going to dive in and we're going to get started. So thank you all for joining us.
You betcha. Thank you, Jerry. Hey, everybody. We don't have the chat on today. Just a little FYI. If you jump over to the Q&A tab, that's where we're going to take most of our questions. Because there is no chat, if you wanted to start a little topic thread as a Q&A, feel free to do that, and we'll keep half an eye on this to make sure that we are doing our very best to listen in and respond to your questions and comments. We've got a test one at the very bottom there. Let us know where you're joining us from. And I guess to kick us off, my name's Emma Gray. I'm based in Vancouver, Canada. And I am the product manager for Search Progress, which means that I worked with the researchers, I worked with educators around the world and students with all of their feedback to make this product along with our engineers and designers here at Microsoft. And I have the absolute pleasure to work with Jerry, who makes all of these things real. We say she sort of turns our products from Pinocchios into real voice by bringing them into the classroom and making them alive and making them work with teachers. Jerry, what are you up to these days?
Well, thank you so much. That was amazing. I appreciate that introduction. Yes. Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Jerry Gillespie. I am the industry advisor for US and Canada and for Microsoft Elevate. I have been in education for 3 decades. My oldest is 30. I always say and laughed at, he keeps me honest. So I had him in May and was in the classroom by that fall. So I am happy here to talk about this conversation. We're going to talk about visible learning. We're going to talk about Search Coach. We're going to jump into and Search Progress. We're going to jump into all different kinds of conversations here. But as we go through this and share this, I want to make sure that we honor your time and that it's valuable. I can ask any educator around the world, what is the one resource they never have enough of, and it's time. So this is your time. So even if you are watching this recorded webinar and have questions, please reach out to Emma or myself or the team. We're happy to continue the discussion and the conversation. We want to make sure you're getting what you need out of this discussion. And most of all, thank you for being here. Thank you for joining the discussion, especially as we look at, where artificial intelligence is and where it is in education as we go through. Now, I mentioned that I am an industry advisor for Microsoft Elevate. There was an announcement last summer about reorganization of our K-12 customers and our community colleges in U.S., realigning under the organization that is more with our nonprofits. And honestly, it's about mission-driven institutions. It's about how we come together as a community and are supporting, especially those educators in K-12 and community colleges in the U.S. And it's centered around people and communities, which has been essential throughout my entire career. So as we go through this, we want to make sure that we are talking about, again, how these changes are evolving and the skills that are changing and how we're measuring that change now, because this is part of that discussion. Whenever I was working with my staff or even myself as a young educator, I learned that switch over where it mattered about what students were learning and not just about what I was teaching. And, I will never forget this most amazing lesson that I taught, having students measure perimeter and area of a building. They were so excited. We had new carpets, and my principal said, sure, have your students work with the people that are coming in and starting to do their measurements. And I've never had students most engaged. And when we went, to go ahead and put that from what we had done in that hands-on activity into now, that transfer and being able to assess those skills, I saw where students missed that connect, and I had to connect the dots for them. I had to make what they had just learned and connect that prior knowledge. And we're going to talk a lot about that today as we go through this, because right now we can feel what's happening with AI, and we can see how the skills are transferring and changing as we add in more artificial intelligence, how we bring in those essential skills that have always been difficult for us to teach because they're so abstract. Critical thinking, conversation, discussion, but they're so essential now. And these are skills that we've been working on for decades. As educators, I know that we have been adding in these skills as we've gone through, especially around problem solving and critical thinking. And we've seen where AI is transferring the world in the business world. So we've got our students, no matter what level they are, we have got that one purpose where we want students to be able to prepare for the future. We're preparing for them to be able to become part of the community, be part of, happy, healthy, and being able to be independent themselves, right? My 3 children, my husband and I have always had that goal, right? We're trying to get them off our paycheck. Got one more. And we want them happy and healthy. But we see where these transitions are changing. And for the first time, we have this technology that is so powerful that it could be the last technological advancement that's developed completely by humans. Right? Because there's always going to be now some kind of artificial intelligence way for us to help amplify the work that we're doing. But we cannot lose sight that it is about this human opportunity, that it is human in the loop, it is human at the center of this work. And as we look at these skills, I'm always trying to back down and saying directly, what is it that we're talking about? When we talk about critical thinking, we talk about the type of skills that students need to be able to have. I go back to research that I know was so essential, even as a building leader, when we were working with our students. We always talked about more career in college because we know there's different avenues to be able to get to those spaces as far as getting into that career. But when it comes down to understanding and thinking about the knowledge, we want to think internally about the skills that we're taking ourselves and having that ability to ideate and think about how this information is coming to us, those metacognitive skills. And then also, how are we understanding that? Now, how are we creating new concepts from that? How is that adding to the information we have, right? How are we understanding at a deeper level so that we can create and act and be able to do something with the information we're taking in? And then the ability to adapt. That's going to be key, especially as we have this emerging technology. This technology is evolving and changing. And so how do we help support those skills of adaptation? Emma, I know, a little fact about Emma. I know Emma was an intern when we were working in engineering. So I have seen her graduate from university coming in. How do these skills kind of resonate with you, Emma?
It's interesting. And I am in a position now where university they need to, one second, I think my headphones just connect. Can you?
No.
There I am.
There you are.
Well, I was saying I'm lucky enough now to be in the position where university students are reaching out to me and asking what skills they need for a changing workplace. And it's so interesting to see, as the tools that we're using in this job is changing, as we're embracing AI at work, how these sort of 4 chunks of skills remain evergreen, regardless of the tool that we're applying to get the job done. And so it really is these deeper sort of human, like interaction and critical thinking, analytical thinking skills that are helping us navigate the way that jobs are changing so quickly. And certainly I think they're going to be the things that help to prepare students to embrace whatever workplace they end up employed into, which is certainly going to be different than the one that I started in as well. So I think as long as you double down on those ones, you're future ready. It doesn't matter what skills or tools are required on top of that. I think if you've got those, you've got a good foundation.
No, definitely. And as we look at this too, I always bring this up in conversation, especially when I'm working with leaders or educators and looking at those skills and workforce skills, because although as educators, we make up a very small percentage, globally, it's around 2.8% of educators in the world. However, those students sitting in our classrooms, those students sitting in, our schools, those are the future workforce. Those are 100% of the future workforce of those students at that time in our in our environment, in our learning community. So this is something that's impacting us. And now as educators are joining the collective, we need to have those voices step up, and we need to take what we know about education, what we know about instructional strategies, what we know about what works for students, because technology and artificial intelligence is that transfer skill. So we need to understand what AI is and what it's not. And so understanding how AI is, again, that logical pattern understanding of data and patterns that are out there. So it's about that data, it's about that information. So how are we using that information? How are we making intentional, purposeful, so that we can amplify what it is that we want to accomplish? So we can reach those students and those learning targets that we're looking for.
Jerry, I heard something.
Go ahead.
Sorry to interrupt.
No.
I heard something interesting about AI and data recently that I thought could be interesting for this crew, which is how people are positioning it as a source. So we've got our primary sources, our secondary sources, tertiary sources. We've been teaching that for decades. But then what is AI in that spectrum? And we like to think about it beyond tertiary sources. And so when we think about the practices that we might want to bring to the classroom, it's not straight from the word of mouth of the person who was there. It's not secondary, it's not citing those people. It's not tertiary to the extent that it's like, sure, it's collecting sources, but the actual AI generated information itself is actually some further order down the line. And so the skills that we've brought to students over the decades of always go back to those primary and secondary sources, or to the trustworthy tertiary ones. Those things apply as strongly now as I think they ever have. And I really loved that framing.
No, I appreciate that, because what we're looking at is how we're rewiring the way we're thinking.
Mm-hmm.
I worked with a speech and language pathologist, and she was talking about how when she works with students, she's changing the way that they're wiring and the way that they articulated information before. Now we're in that space where we're trying to rewire the way that we're thinking. And I think about that as looking at different sources. That's another way for us to be able to look at this, to make sure that we're thinking about our skills, critical thinking, what's essential to us as humans, and then bringing that in. And if we look at the skills in these AI journey, and we're going to talk about this, and this is where, especially with search progress, and what we're talking about fits in this conversation, we're talking about AI powered support that's going to then integrate as students build those skills, as students build that cognitive ability to have that deeper reasoning, to have those critical thinking skills. Because we know younger students can do this, and they're able to do this, and they're able to think at levels. But, I think about my own granddaughter, who still thinks that when we drive up to the mountain for snow, if we let over the special gnome, that we're going to have special, we're going to have good snow all night. So there are still levels that make her, the child that she is, and the brilliant fourth grader that she is. But there's some levels of thinking that are still developing. So as we use these AI-powered supports and tools, and then get into more productive ways where students are preparing for the workforce, and then getting into certifications at space, it is a journey that starts early. But it's about the discussions and the conversations that we're starting to have in first, and how we're connecting those dots. And it makes sense that still students are feeling a little bit in the mix of, what does this look like for me? What does it look like for us? Us as educators, us as grown-ups, us as parents, as adults, as a community, as a workforce. We're still looking at AI and as it's emerging and evolving. So it makes sense that students are feeling this also. I found this data very interesting, and I bet you're going to see that same type of feeling of, am I ready, or am I getting the right information from others, even in this space.
And, Jerry, global organizations know that this is something that students are asking for in terms of more support. And they also know that these new skills that are being brought along, or this doubling down of the particular skills you've been mentioning, is something that is going to require a global effort. And so the Future of Jobs report, Jerry, if you can hit one more time, we've got an animation just to highlight some key skills there, are coming through more and more and more, aligning with the things that you were highlighting earlier. We know that these are going to be the most future ready or future proof skills for our learners. And PISA recently announced that their 2029 assessment is going to be on media and artificial intelligence literacy. So those two things so closely knit together, the ability to critically evaluate information. Jerry, you can shift to the next slide here, regardless of where that information comes from. And so they very recently posted a draft version of their assessment for this coming up. For those of you who don't know what the PISA assessment is, it's a global assessment of 15-year-olds around the world, across many different countries, to get a sense of what the benchmark is and where we can grow in building these skills in the global population. And so you can see here the ability to analyze and evaluate information, to create it, to access it and use it, and to reflect on it and act responsibly. These are all really, really crucial sets of skills, not just for AI interactions, but also just in today's online information ecosystem. So Jerry, if we can go to the next slide, a study was done a few years ago now that tells us a little more about where we're at today. Now, this was a poll of American students, but similar studies around the world have shown similar results, which is that the baseline media literacy skills that we would want to instill in learners are not quite where we would hope for them to be in order for them to really seize this AI opportunity, or even just to navigate social media and all these other new ways that information is entering their lives. We always like to joke that we didn't evolve as humans to take in the amount of information that we do every day. And yet we are receiving more information on a daily basis than we ever have. So everything from 8 out of 10 middle school students not understanding the difference between sponsored content and a legitimate news story, or Jerry, on the next slide, the study showing that the bar for evidence for something to be credible is quite low in the minds of the students who were polled. And this was a study of thousands of students. 40% of high schoolers claiming that this Imgur image of these daisies was strong evidence of conditions near a nuclear power plant. It turns out this is actually one of the most common genetic abnormalities in daisies. I might see that on a hike in the Rocky Mountains, nowhere near any kind of nuclear power plant. And so the structured, scaffolded thinking that we're hoping to instill in learners spans today's online information ecosystem. It spans future-ready AI skills, and it can also have a real impact on well-being. You think about a student scrolling through social media and taking everything coming at them at face value, rather than someone who's been equipped with a couple of tools to pause and reflect, to have the metacognitive strength to say, hey, is this something that's making me feel strong feelings? Is it selling me something? Is the goal for it to change the way that I think about something else? And do I have enough reasons to really entertain that? We've got students taking advice from non-experts on the internet more and more now, and we're seeing some of the repercussions of that. And you can see how social media literacy, and AI literacy all together can form part of your psychological immune system as you navigate today's world, whether that's in the workplace or whether it's at home. Search Progress really aims to address some of those core information literacy skills, those transferable skills that you can bring no matter where you go in the online information ecosystem. So think about any AI chat ever. At the very bottom, it might say something like, AI can get things wrong, check important information. This focuses on that check important information piece and giving you the skills and the tools, the vocabulary to really navigate that with confidence. Is there anything you'd add, Jerry, as we move into learning accelerators?
No, I think that you've hit that. And we've seen this across the world, across the globe. We've talked about now where students are looking at, even with social media and the media skills that need to be happening. And we're looking at how that's changing because, even with my own children, and they would hear things on social media, I'd say, now, really, does that make sense to you? Right. So again, it's the amount of media. And I think that's where we needed to be more intentional before and how we're looking at that. And I was just talking with educational leaders, even this morning, that I was meeting with, and they're saying, they're trying to talk about how AI can be, that best friend that's on always telling the truth. So you have to be able to tell what that looks like. And it starts with the media literacy skills that we need to help develop and come through. It's that transition that we're trying to take students to, and that cognition. But what I appreciate about the learning accelerators here too is that all of these are designed, and I know you're going to show an example of how Search Progress works with our Speaker Progress, but these meet educators where they're at. They allow students to bring in those thinking skills. I always look at programs or applications or where I can hit on those skills that I know that are more abstract, that are not as concrete. I can still teach the content that I'm responsible for teaching. I can bring this and challenge students that need more of a challenge, and then I can also support those students that need more of the scaffolding. These are these types of applications and tools, and you can access them. Now, we're going to talk about where you can use these assignments out of Teams, but you can also access them, right? You can get them
in the M365 LTI. So, yes, great call out, Jerry. Learning accelerators you can think of as an attachment to an assignment, either in Teams for Education or in your learning management system of choice through the new Microsoft 365 LTI integration. So that means that this can live where your assignments already live, in any of those platforms, whether it's Teams or an LTI compatible platform. So ideally, they come to you, and you could think of them as additional scaffolded activities that can be attached to any assignment. So Jerry, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about how learning accelerators help us with process and visibility.
Yes, and this is something that's hard to myself too. When I look at educational research, and a lot of times where I'm in this space, and even finishing my own, going through a dissertation and that levels, and the academic research that we've been, especially as educational leaders and other educators out there that have gone through this process and research. There's a comment even in the chat right now talking about giving opportunities to students in more academic ways to use technology and to build on these skills like this, what we're talking about. To me, I look at those meta-analysis evaluation, when you look at those visible teaching, and learning. It's not just about what I taught, but it's about what students have learned and how they're able to use that and put it into play. I'm going to go back on that earlier story I talked about. Like, my students were engaged. They were there and they were measuring and they were, learning about perimeter and area. But when I had to put it in a place where they need to see it at a different level, a different medium, they struggled. And so I needed to be able to see more in that visible, way of how they're taking that information, how they're acting and doing. And so that's where we're talking about these invisible processes that are a lot of times very difficult to be able to give, concrete examples to our students. We now are going to pull on these types of AI powered types of solutions to get to that visible teaching and learning, so we can see students take that ownership. It's the one thing they own. Their education is the one thing that they own and they have. So how we can bring them so that they can get that feedback and they can see that progression in that learning.
Absolutely. And the invisible process is interesting, right? We've, until recently, in many, many contexts around the world, had a pretty product-focused education system. Out of necessity, we are able to assess someone's understanding of something based on the quality of their essay or their standardized test skills. And we have decades of research on how formative assessment can benefit students better than summative assessment. And yet still, because of all of the additional overhead that often puts on the educator's plate, we find ourselves in more summative territory. And where that leaves students behind is the students whose challenges lie in that invisible process. And so I remember, and Jerry was a middle school math teacher, so you probably know the same feeling in your students of relief and frustration when a math question says, show your work. Because there are two things happening there. The first thing is it's making sure I'm not using my calculator and circumventing my thinking. And the second thing it's doing is it's giving me an opportunity for part marks, or an opportunity to show that maybe I know the first 3 or 4 steps of this really well, but that I stumble on, step 4 in solving a particular equation. And what's so powerful about shifting our focus to the process over the product is that idea that it doesn't leave as many learners behind. We're able to catch opportunities to bridge gaps before they widen. It gives students confidence in being able to show what they do know, even if it's not 100%. And it also allows for more opportunities to build that cognitive muscle for students to really build the metacognitive skills and to reflect on their own process and their own thinking as they do it. So yeah, doubling down on that, sort of reinforcing the process.
I'm also going to jump in here too, because you were exactly right on that too. And I'm going to go back to there's some more work about Nottingham's work about looking at the learning. We have something called the learning pit, right? Where that struggle needs to happen in that it's that kind of sweet spot where you don't want students to struggle too much, where they feel overwhelmed and they have that learned helplessness, like they can't learn this. This is too difficult. But there has to be some level of complexity. It can't be too easy. And I think that right now is where we're even seeing technology integrated, getting some, not seeing the results in learning that we want to get, and also the questions about AI and the fears there that it's going to not engage our students in those critical thinking skills that we want, right? We're programmed to take things easy, right? I was the first remote control in my house for my parents, right? Run up to the TV and turn the channel. And then as we've gone through and those have evolved, we've learned to be able to use technology to do things easier. But there's also a time where we need to remember it's a transfer skill, and we need to have some of that complexity. So how are we pushing back to still learn the skills that we need for a future workforce, especially around AI, but still developing those critical thinking skills along the way and making that learning visible?
Exactly. Now, Jerry, I think we're doing really well on time. So I want to address a question in the chat and actually shimmy back to our Learning Accelerator slide here. The question in the chat is about the tension between the amount of time and overhead that process-focused feedback takes And, despite it being the best practice, I think you're exactly right. Chat person whose name I won't say because there's going to be a recording, and we do this for privacy reasons. It can be way harder to implement. Educators already have a lot on their plates. And so what does it mean to support you in providing formative feedback? There are some thoughts on this, I think, that I have relating to learning accelerators, but I'm wondering if Jerry, as the former educator, you might be willing to take a first swing.
I do. I'm going to let you come in with the strength of the product, and it's why I even implemented learning accelerators in my practice across. And it's the first thing I start with, especially when I'm having instructional conversations. We understand feedback is essential. Definitely, even going off of the question that we have in this space. But this is what we mean by AI powered. It means that it's managed and being it's being generated, it's being managed by the educator. It's a professional that's going to be getting that feedback, but the feedback can also come back to the student and come to the educator. So we're able to use those sources of feedback. And that AI powered is what we mean by having that human in the loop and amplifying that educator in that process. Can you talk a little bit about, like, explain how that works within these learning accelerators? Because as we go through this and show you a few more slides, and we're going to show you what this looks like, you're going to see how that feedback comes back and those insights that need to come to the educator, so that they can help. And most importantly, how that feedback can get back to students who need to be able to see this in their own growth and learning.
100%. So when we think about process, I think about it in two ways. I think about sort of frequency of formative assessment, where it's easier to provide like shorter pieces of feedback, but over lots of little spurts. An example of a learning accelerator doing that really well is reading progress. So reading progress was invented actually by my manager and a team with him many, many years ago, like 4 or 5, which is many, many in the technology standards. They were sitting in the back of a class, and they noticed how long it took for manual fluency assessments to happen. A teacher would pull a kid out into the hallway. I'm sure this audience is familiar with that. You've got a piece of paper and a stopwatch. You're annotating frantically as the kid is reading out loud. You're highlighting mispronunciations and omissions and everything else. And because this happens one teacher and one student at a time, over and over and over and over, till you cover the whole class, it only happens once, maybe twice per term in many circumstances. Reading progress automates the fluency assessment process. It always lets the educator do the final review, but it lets kids pop onto their device, do a full reading, and then get the fully annotated mispronunciations, omissions, duplications, self-corrections, prosody, comprehension, everything that you would want from a reading fluency assessment, but in a much lighter lift for the educator. You get class level insights and all kinds of interesting touch points where you can lean in and leverage the frequency of these assessments to make changes a little bit more quickly. So when I think process-focused feedback for like higher frequency things where the process is over many, many days or weeks or months, reading progress is a great example of that. In terms of process-focused, like the depth of this one thing I'm looking at is really difficult to generate feedback for. I think about speaker progress, where students are able to practice presenting in real time and get AI feedback curated by the teacher in terms of what it is they actually want the students to get feedback on. They practice their presentation, it's recorded with their screen shared, they can see the whole thing. Then you get a report at the end that, based on the settings that you toggle on and off, you get suggested AI narrative feedback on how the student did in that presentation. And so when we talk about process in terms of preparing for a presentation, now we're talking about having 2 or 3 speaker progress assignments before your final in-class version. And this is where the AI can actually get really deep and propose better formative feedback for learners over multiple touch points for one big deliverable. So there are some things that are interesting here, and search progress is all about transparency, and we'll see that soon, making the process of student thinking visible. And you don't need to do this for every student, like dive super deeply into their show your thinking process for research, but it can certainly be helpful for your higher flyers and your lower flyers to figure out how you can challenge the children that need it at the top. And I say children, middle schoolers and high schoolers love search progress, or better support the learners that are getting stuck in places. And so with limited time, I would say focusing on the students on the outskirts of your class rather than sort of the histogram, middle of the curve, and reading and speaker as examples of sort of increase in touch points and also deeper proposed formative feedback that does take a look at the process, I think can be really helpful.
Is there anything you'd add to that, Jerry, before we jump forward?
No, I'm going to add a little bit as you go through. I'm going to wait till you go through. If you go forward, and especially when you bring up speaker progress with that overlying space, that too, because I know that's where we're going to get into.
You betcha. All right, so evergreen skills. Here are a bunch of them. And when I think about my own schooling, and certainly a beloved artifact in many educators' minds, the persuasive essay does a pretty good job, or historically has, in taking a look at all of these skills and putting them into one assessment. Are we able to synthesize different perspectives and weigh evidence and evaluate sources and build conviction and communicate that well? Now, the challenge, of course, with a persuasive essay today is that it's not entirely easy to figure out how much student thinking went into that product. And this is where being able to wrap the essay in various artifacts can be really helpful. And so we're talking about the research and judgment and inquiry that goes into the product, and then perhaps the synthesis and the communication that can come on the other side of it. And so you might still be assigning persuasive essays, but if you're an educator using learning accelerators, you may do a first assignment with search progress where the student shows their thinking and their work heading into the research that creates the essay. And then once that's been graded and they've gotten their notes and anything else, they could do a speaker progress presentation on it with a slide deck if they want. And now we've wrapped a traditional and sort of keystone educational artifact with process and with synthesis on the other side. So really taking a look at how robust the learning was coming out and how robust the thinking was going in. And that's one way that you can modify a typical assignment with learning accelerators to really make that process visible.
And I'm going to just say, this is where I want to come in too. You can even see with the reports that you get back, especially in speaker progress, you're able to share that and you have a concrete example of looking at targeted skills that you're trying to work on with students. So when you're trying to narrow down those skills, you have something that they can see concretely to be able to get to that space and that next level. And so coming back to that formative assessment, they're able to take in that information and understand and then see how they can get better. You know, I was always about student goal planning and things that I wanted students to be able to do. And, you know, and we struggle this in education. I know that we see what happens in that theory of practice and we want to be able to integrate that. But in the real world, when we're putting in an application, you know, education social doesn't always work that same way with every single student. So it's, you know, when I would try to bring in, you know, student initiated goals and start having them be able to take on that type of, you know, learning strategies, visible learning themselves, they would struggle with the process of even understanding what this would look like, you know. So if they wanted to get better at their math or if they wanted to get better at reading, they just say, you know, get better at reading. They couldn't break down how to isolate those skills. So this, again, are ways to use this to get to the content, because we all know the struggles we have with everything that we need to teach. There's never enough time to reach through and go through the standards in the way that we want to, especially with the rigor that's needed. But I also have another application, another support to have these meaningful conversations, to think about thinking, to do that modeling, and that has those concrete examples to be able to utilize with my students.
Exactly. And so we're going to dive into search progress today. It sounds like we might have opportunities for future webinars on speaker progress, though we can, of course, send resources on that in the chat as well. Search progress was not built in a silo. I mentioned this at the beginning. We partnered recently with the Digital Inquiry Group, which spun out of Stanford after 24 years as the Stanford History Education Group, to come up with a series of scaffolds that an educator can implement in a research assignment to help students build muscle in these different realms of critical thinking. And so I absolutely love that we've been able to invest in this. I think this kind of scaffolding can serve two really important purposes. First, for the educator, it used to just be librarians that were trying to bring the importance of lateral reading and checking for source purpose and reputation to the table. And I think there's a consensus now around the shared responsibility we all have to bring these skills into the loop regardless of the class. Students are navigating the internet all the time for all of their assignments. And so helping equip them with these skills becomes a bit of a shared understanding. And at the very least, we can share the load a little bit. On the other side, for students, what this can do is it can lower the cognitive load just enough that doing this due diligence isn't as ambiguous as it might feel at the beginning. But it can keep enough of the cognitive load that we can practice these skills and hopefully build some reflexes as we're doing our research. And so factual importance is an example. If I turn this on as an educator, every time a student chooses to save a source to their bibliography, they're asked a question, something like, what would the consequences be if this information was wrong? Now, as an educator, you're always able to change what that question is, but that's the default one. And for source reputation, the question is, who is behind this information and what do other sources say about them? And this builds on top of the age-old recommendation of checking your domains. You've got your .orgs and your .edus. And I mean, Jerry, you were saying you bought a domain recently. Anyone can register a .org now. And so some of that wisdom needs updating. And source reputation just patches up any gaps in that, which is I can take a look at a .org, and the difference between knowing whether it's a reputable nonprofit or a special interest funded organization is to just step out of that website, check what other websites say about it, and then I can go back with more context. And so these are the robust civic online reasoning skills that we've focused on as advised by the experts. And we're going to show you how in Search Progress you're able to scaffold any research assignment to have students use any of these exercises as they go through their research.
I will call out as well, you all have access to the Q&A tab. And so if you have any questions for us, absolutely feel free to drop them in there. Jerry and I are keeping an eye and we'll try to address those in real time. Now, Jerry, if you press play, we can walk through what the educator setup for Search Progress looks like. So in Teens assignments, let's say this is our persuasive essay. It's going to be on single-use plastics. For or against, the student should choose a position. And in this particular context, students will edit their own copy of a blank Word document. I'm then able to attach Search Progress, which is like a search engine with training wheels, where students will be able to do all of their thinking work going into this assignment. So you can see those cards that were on the other slide. You can see as well different fields that you can customize. So we have suggested things like describe why you saved this source. That's the simplest little metacognitive moment. Every time a student saves a source, they can document why they chose to save it. Reflection, that's a question that gets asked at the very end. And that is something that allows the students to take a look at their entire journey of inquiry and to reflect on it here. And so in this case, the reflection question is, did your position change over the course of your research? With all those little toggles, you can enable or disable the different cards. And then when you're happy with everything, you can hit assign. Next up, Jerry, and then we can hit play. Perfect. So on the student side, this is what it looks like. Search Progress is the place where I go. You'll notice as well, it has no ads. That's intentional. This is a low distraction surface for engaging with information. You can also see it looks like a traditional search engine. That's also intentional. It's going to mirror the patterns that they'll see out in the wild. And we can go through this whole process of looking into who's writing the different pieces of information that I'm engaging with. If I choose to save a source, it saves the query that got me to that source in the first place. I can jot down why I saved it, and then I can open the investigation window to go in, add citation information if that's something that my educator wants me to add. We have something that will format those citations at the very end for your students. And then source reputation is the thing that was checked off. So, who is the author or organization behind this source? They knew that was coming, so they looked into it. And then the next question has to do with, and what do we know about them? And so in this case, the student's actually looking that up. Who is Procon? These are editors at Britannica. What does that mean? And they managed to find the Wikipedia article that goes into the background of procon.org. Once they understand where exactly these people came from, turns out they were an impressive enough individual group of people that Britannica hired them to write content for this particular article. You can see there that the students are able to add all of that information and record all of their notes and their thinking around that source, including the skills that they're building time and time again based on the scaffolding that you've built. The metacognitive gym, they're getting their reps in, and the hope is that they're able to bring those reflexes into future interactions with online information. Is there anything you'd add here, Jerry, before we go to the teacher experience?
No, I just want to clarify too. So, I mean, they get asked, why did you choose this source, right? I mean, they have to justify their thinking. They have to explain why and how it pertains to the information they're collecting. I mean, and those are the skills that we've been talking about as far as trying to get them to connect the dots and to develop that in their thinking skills in that way.
Exactly. And again, it's that process of repeating it over and over. You engage with the source, you think about why. You engage with the source, you think about its reputation. What has given it its, what gives it the credibility that I would need in order to feel good choosing this as a source for my assignment, whatever it is. And then, okay, here we've got student submission. One more if you hit Jerry. let's say we've zoomed all the way up to the end. You can see here the assignment summary, the reflection field where the student can add their thinking. And you can also scroll down. They can see their entire search journey and submit it all the way at the very, very end. And then, of course, in this case, they will write their essay. So you're able to copy a full list of all of the search progress sources that you've saved. You can include that as a formatted bibliography, an annotated bibliography. And you can also include it in search progress format, which for us means the search query that got you to the source and your explanation for why you saved it. And it's been interesting seeing and hearing from people that they're using that format more than they're using the traditional citation formats right now, because they understand in this context how valuable it is to have the question you asked to get to a specific source and then your justification for why you saved it. Even those 3 steps are so valuable when you see them in a string.
Yeah, especially as you're scaffolding and building these skills on top of each other. And
Exactly.
and this is what I hear from educators often, and actually even in conversations anywhere around artificial intelligence is as well as what I've seen in the evolution of technology and what's brought in the classroom. There has to be some kind of struggle and complexity. We can think about the learning pit, right? If we look at the learning pit that we've talked about, there's got to be some kind of a struggle to come back, not too much where we feel stuck and we can't get out, and we begin to feel that it's impossible to be able to overcome or to learn, but there has to be a little bit of a thinking and a struggle to get there. And that's what we're trying to do, especially with being able to learn using these learning accelerators. So I'm going to go to the next slide.
You betcha. Yeah. And it's something that our chief scientist at Microsoft, Dr. Jamie Teven, has said is this. She published a report citing a cognitive forcing function as something that people are looking more and more into. And that's just a fancy word for things that make you think harder and where strategically it makes the most sense to add those moments. Now, as educators, you've been thinking about where to add cognitive forcing functions, moments of productive struggle in your students' lives for decades. And so it's really cool to see and to explore how we can bring that into digital learning environments as well. These are the different types of exports that I mentioned before, sort of in a formatted traditional citation format, and then also as search progress format with your search terms that got you there and the explanations at the end. This can be copied and pasted into any future assignment.
Amazing.
And then educator review time. You want to lead us through, Jerry? I can also.
No, go ahead. Talk about what this looks like as far as an educator. Being able to go through and see this work and assess, this is what you're going to be able to see and go through. So you've got another tangible resource to be able to not only assess the content and be able to look at what that content is, and you can also create, our rubrics can align with us so that you're looking at content, but you can also create rubrics, right? Some of that are based on the task and the skills of search, which are so essential.
Yes, and you can make those rubrics with AI actually. And this is the fun part that we had a conversation at a previous Search Progress webinar about this. The idea that in the SpeedGrader view, you've got your artifact, which is your essay, the work behind it, which is your search progress, and then the rubric assessing things like research and media literacy skills. One educator said, I would really love to be able to do that, but this isn't my area of expertise. I don't know what I would put on a rubric to assess these skills. And with AI rubrics and teams for education, it's been so wonderful to hear people say, I feel empowered now to put words to what it means to measure these skills, because I can say in my normal language, this is what I would love to be able to measure as a part of this assignment, and it can generate and iterate with you to build the rubric that you would want to use for this assignment. You're able to fill out that rubric right from this view as well. So the scaffolds are there for the students, for their thinking. You build those. There are also scaffolds for you that you can leverage in this platform to really bring this forward. And this again goes back to the fact that we know librarians have had this training for decades. We know that our history educators, our English educators, everyone's got a piece of the pie here, but more and more the responsibility is shifting to everyone to help the students build these critical thinking skills. And so the hope is that with scaffolds for learners and with scaffolds for educators, we're able to reduce some of the burden of feeling like you need to do all of this extra work to build these skills into an existing assignment.
Yeah, and it also gives you a clear leeway for you as an educator. You can see where you need to intervene. You can see where you need to support different students with different spaces, if you're going to be able to break students into different smaller groups, differentiate anyway to help support students, you're able to add in more scaffolds, add in more of those lower level questions to get to the higher, deeper level questions. You're able to have that one assignment that can reach the students that you need to push further, that are more and need those challenges in the higher, that are maybe above grade level in their thinking and the ways in their development, and then those students that need extra support along the way as they're going through this process. As an educator, I'm empowered to be able to use, again, any content that I have. So if it's curriculum that I'm following, I always talk about viable, our guaranteed and viable curriculum. I understand that as an education leader and how essential that is, and especially with where we are in our meeting standards and meeting the expectations of those learning outcomes. But this is an application that can help you bring that in this space to still be able to reach students, and it's that AI powered that is amplifying what you're doing as an educator. It's also amplifying what students are doing in their thinking, because it's that direct feedback that they're able to get. It's consistent, it's specific, and it's what we know helps move students within those processes and skills that we're talking about. And this, as we go through the insights, I think is the most valuable piece for me, because I was always looking at why students were getting answers wrong versus even the ones that were getting right, because then I could go find the holes that I needed to be able to plug, especially as a middle school math teacher. So talk to us about these educator insights, Emma.
Absolutely. And Jerry, the best feedback that I ever got as we were taking this feature set into preview was from a 7th grade student. They had me on a screen at the front of the class. The kids had been kicking the tires with early search progress for a couple of weeks at this point, and had all taken notes about what they liked and they didn't like. And one kid said, I like this because I'm not a very good writer, but I ask really good questions. And that was just like, it just made my heart so happy, because there's something about, and you can feel this, and I think your math students probably, Jerry, felt this. There's that moment of, oh, I have to show my work in this question. Like that's a lot of work, but also maybe I get part marks. Maybe there's an opportunity for me to be recognized for the skills that I bring to the table that maybe wouldn't have surfaced otherwise. And so in this way, though, for a written assignment, we can see that students who are curious, who ask really deep questions and struggle with the written output, we're going to work very differently with that student than a student who is asking very surface level questions and produces an excellent essay. And so this helps you as an educator as well calibrate your interventions for each student. And we can go super deeply, and if you hit next, Jerry, into the way that the student's inquiry has unfolded here. And so in this first view, we can see Christy Klein and the searches that she did in order, how many links she opened for each search, and how many links she saved. We can see as well, compared to the class median, where that puts her. And we heard from educators, this is actually most valuable in terms of understanding and calibrating your own style of formative assessment. Because what happens if the students are doing hundreds of searches to try to get to an answer that I thought was going to be easy? Or what happens if everyone's finishing this in 1 or 2 queries when I was hoping they would spend a little bit more time? It helps me to adjust for future assignments as well, which is really interesting. You can jump to the next one here, Jerry.
And you can know, and as you look at that also too, in going in this space, it's important information for the learner to also see, and they can see that in that feedback that's coming on, because you hit that, like when they understand what their strengths are and where they're at, they're able to even rely on those strengths to get and make a difference for those that are more challenging for them. And that's the why that educators feel. That's when they see that impact, they can see that, and that's what we talk about in visible learning, where students can show the power of their thinking where they are in that space. And
we talk about learning in community as well. Something like a word cloud is a really fun thing to put in front of the class at the end of an assignment and go, hey, these are the words that you used to try to get to an answer on this topic. So if we're all writing persuasive essays for and against a specific topic, and it's the same one, we can then pull up this word cloud and have really interesting class communities where students are trading ideas off of each other. And oh, who used that word? Why did you use that word? This becomes a really interesting conversation about how we access information in the first place.
Amazing. Next, are we
there are
next?
1 or 2 of these. Yeah, right. There are 1 or 2 more, just to give you a sense of the depth of this. You can take a look, if you just go back one, Jerry, sources that the student saved. This is interesting because you can see, I'll just call this one part out, saves by classmates. So this gives you a cross-sectional view into the inquiry. And again, this is more helpful if people are doing an assignment on the same topic. But we can see in this case, 10 students saved Wikipedia, which, as we know, is a tertiary source, and maybe shouldn't necessarily be in a list of works cited in the same way that, primary and secondary sources should be. And so that's an interesting conversation to have. We can see also, Christy was the only one in the class who chose to save the space.com resource, which is also interesting because it means that maybe she was doing something a little bit differently than her classmates. If we go to the next, just jump forward to Jerry.
One more.
We can see the overall list of most saved things by class. Here we go, links opened. If we look at the space.com one and we look down, we can see the number 6. That means that it was the 6th result on the list of search results. And her other classmates didn't even open that resource. So now we have a sense that Christy is unique in the class and that she scrolled down really far to find that. And that demonstrates click restraint, which we know is an important online digital literacy skill. So there are all of these interesting things if you want to get sleuthing, and you don't need to do this for every student. But like Jerry said, understanding when a student is falling short or has gone sideways or has discovered the intentionally false website about the Pacific Northwest tree octopus, which is an animal that doesn't exist but is used frequently, at least on the West Coast here, to give examples to students of information on the internet that isn't always correct. You can then understand where it was in that process that the student might have turned left when they could have turned right, and where exactly they may have gone on a tangent or where they might have been misled, rather than having to take a look at a black box of a list of works cited and go, I don't even know how you got there. And so this is the kind of thing, think it's research with transparency mode on for you as the educator to get a sense of how the student is thinking throughout this process.
And these are some examples too. I think as we go into that, right, we've got some examples here. I just wanted to kind of show, even looking at this, I came from early in my career in school that I was in was focused on project-based learning, solution-based learning. I know that it's evolved and changed depending on what it is and how you kind of label or call it, but it's about that deeper level of getting students engaged in working on projects. And so just even looking at, this was an example of, trying to dream of a school garden. And I know we even had students in our schools, I think every school that I've been in, there's been some kind of form of ways that they wanted to build a garden in that. But just looking at this and ways that you can have that driving question, what it can look like within search progress, and then bring it out full scale and what that can look in their assessment. Now, and again, meeting students where they're at different levels, because they're going to take this depending on where they are and challenge themselves, or even be able to scaffold and bring in those information. Looking at even in more of a middle intermediate kind of setting, you can look at career choices and looking at the clusters of careers, and then taking that and diving further into some of those career options. Again, this is a way for them to start wrapping their heads around what research looks like. How do they even dive down into? Because a lot of times we'll put students in these spaces where we want them to have these big ideas, but then we don't have the process or understanding or steps how to get there. So this is that scaffold. It's going to help them walk through to be able to make that smaller and able for them to understand. And along the way, they're going to be building those critical thinking skills that we've been talking about and assessing all the way through this. And then even looking in at high school, you can connect the dots here and looking at media and misinformation and sources, and having them dive in and understand why it may be a source that doesn't have the right information. And you and I had a conversation even early on, especially about like the .edus, the .orgs, the .blogs, everything that's out there. Even that, it's not an indicator anymore. I mean, I know because I've even purchased my own URLs out there, but it's a way for us to question that, right, Emma? I mean, you and I had that conversation about that.
Yes, we did. And it's interesting because we've seen where the standards are today. We've seen how the state of the art, what the sort of most commonly research recognized best skills are for online information literacy. And it can take both that we bring to the classroom to really squeeze the most out of this. And so when you're looking at different URLs, and like Jerry said, .orgs, it turns out anyone can purchase a .org. And so it doesn't have the same gravitas that it might have had 5 or 10 years ago. And so that source reputation card specifically, there was an article in Time magazine about how that, written by Dr. Sam Weinberg, who is actually the digital inquiry group leader, that really goes into how source reputation is that big skill that we should be teaching everybody. Because if you are to choose between 2 different .orgs, one which is a real nonprofit and one which was created by a special interest group, it takes stepping outside of that source and seeing what other sources of information say about them, what their reputation is, to understand which one is more credible. And it's the same idea that you wouldn't hire somebody for a job without checking their references. You wouldn't fully take a source for all of its metal without checking what other sources are saying about it. And so that skill, it's something that we're trying to build some automaticity in for the students. And that goes back to that concept of the metacognitive gym. If it's easy, if it doesn't feel hard, because I've done the reps at this point to make that kind of thinking more automatic, then all of a sudden I am scrolling on social media in the evening and someone is telling me they're giving me financial advice. And I might pause for a moment and go, okay, well, what qualifies this person to give me this advice? And maybe I'll stop and I'll pause and maybe I'll look them up on the internet and I'll realize that, hey, this person actually doesn't have the education background or doesn't have the experience or doesn't have whatever credentials they might need to be able to give me the kind of guidance that they claim to be qualified to giving me. And so all of that wrapped together is the kind of thing that can build out that psychological immune system that can have students pause, not take things at face value, and succeed not only in traditional information environments, but also on social media and also when they're using AI tools. So all of that goodness can be wrapped up into some really specific skills that we hope to deliver through Search Progress.
Yeah, and that again is a way of retraining and rethinking about this, especially as this technology continues to emerge and evolve, just as the way that we search on the World Wide Web, browsers that we use have continued to evolve and change. And now even with the infusion of AI and artificial intelligence in that way too, because we know that AI is not a search engine. It's something way more powerful than that, especially with the different models that are out there. But this is a way for us to be able to break that down and scaffold, especially as those students that are developing these critical thinking skills to pull continuously back. So if you look here, we kind of put together a simple template, like that driving question, right? The scaffolds, the suggestions, we've got the product that we want to have here. We've got the assignment prompts that you would need. And then of course, looking at that teacher view and those assessment pieces of how you want to be able to look at this. I've always followed a pattern where, and especially when I was working with my staffing, looking that we wanted students to be able to understand that learning outcome. And then we wanted to make sure that we continued that cycle. So how are we going to be able to have them create with what they learned? Because they need to be able to do, right? If we're going to be able to understand this at a deeper level, we need to be able to actually dive in and create. And then how are we sharing that knowledge? Has that. How are we sharing their thinking? And then we can get into that do. That means go out an application in real world and go be able to put this that they've learned and assimilate, be able to pull that together, synthesize all the information they have to deliver that. And so as we look through that, we've got these Search Progress resources that are here, but I want to get to a point because we're almost getting to the end, Emma.
Jump to connecting the dots. I think all of these slides are at the back, and we're also going to share all these links are at the back, and we'll share you some resources afterwards because you'll get the recording too.
We definitely will. And connecting the dots on why we wanted this conversation for months is because there's been so much discussion about where and how students are using artificial intelligence in here. And we do definitely need to look at the skills and the questions of the skills that are needed. But a lot of times we will talk about higher level skills and not break down what that looks like in concrete levels as students take in those skills, as they adapt and as they continue to learn. This is a resource that's going to help connect the dots between what we're talking about and those similar skills of artificial intelligence that are needed. I know Emma's going to talk about this too, because she will say they are so aligned that we need to make sure that we are working on and evaluating and having students evaluate for themselves, have students be able to see it for themselves and where they are. Learners need to be able to take in this information. And that's why it's so important that we're looking and talking about these media literacy skills when we're looking at skills that are going to support artificial intelligence. Emma.
You're right, Jerry, and there's no surprise, or at least there wasn't a surprise. If anything, there was excitement and relief to see that the 2029 PISA assessment puts media and AI literacy together, because you need both skill sets in order to succeed in this next workforce, and also just to be a healthier and happier and more thriving human today. So this general idea that you can build out a more robust way of thinking, that's going to benefit you whether you're someone who produces written documents for a living, whether you're someone who creates presentations, whether you're someone who is all based in relationships. We saw some early headlines in the very, very early days of AI of people, lawyers getting their licenses removed because they were citing cases that don't exist. And so that that reflex skill that we want to build, that really baseline critical thinking, analytical thinking, source verification, all of that comes back to using AI successfully as well. In the same way you might not cite Wikipedia in your list of works cited, you probably shouldn't cite the AI directly either. And so those media literacy skills are so crucial to scaffold and to support really successful and to really embrace like the full potential of using AI tools as well.
And I'm going to be able to say now do, right? So we've learned this. We've had this great discussion today. We've learned about search progress. Come out there, go try it. I encourage you, go. I heard even if you have different learning management systems, right, you're able to access this is through the LTI that you can get within the different learning management system. If you have access to Teams, you can see where you can get those assignments that are in that space. Go explore, be able to dive in. Our Microsoft Elevate for Educators, this is that group where we can go onto Microsoft Learn. You can join this community and get answers. We have, again, pretty soon our window is opening to become that expert level. Enjoy, engage in the conversation, engage in the community. We even have communities, right, Emma, with the product team that
if you hit the next slide, Jerry, we have links for that as well. So yes, we have all kinds of different communities and programs. We also have another webinar around feedback and lesson planning and how Copilot can show up in the classroom. So please do feel free to register for that. I think because this is PowerPoint Live, you can even click these links, fun fact. But in terms of communities and programs to join, Jerry mentioned Elevate for Educators, which is our global community of educators all around the world. We also, on the product side, so for those of us on the engineering teams, we have a group of EDU insiders, which is thousands of educators around the world who are under NDA and who provide us unvarnished feedback on our earliest ideas and who iterate with us in those early days of product ideas in order to create things that are genuinely useful. And so I am lucky enough to get to be on calls with educators every single week, sharing their feedback, helping to shape the scope of what it is that we're building. And we pair that with the research and the experts and the technology available to us to build the new products that you see week over week and month over month. So if you want to be an insider, join us there. And if you want all of the newest stuff in your own Microsoft environment for your school, you can have your administrator join the technology adoption program, which is that final link there, join tab. And basically what that means is that as we slowly roll out new features to the world, you're included in one of the inner circles rather than being one of the last people in the world to have access to it. And so if you want to try things a little bit earlier and be on the cutting edge with us, that's how you join that program as well.
And you can also reach out. You can see our Microsoft Elevate events. There are more events and more webinars, more opportunities to learn like this. We are so proud and excited to be able to kick off this signature series. There is going to be a webinar like this every month, so stay tuned for our next webinar that'll be coming up. If you have ideas for webinar, feel free to reach out to me. I definitely will share that information. We have an amazing team that wants to support educators and meet them where they're at around the world and have these conversations. It is so important that we come together as a collective right now, that educators share their voice, their knowledge, their experience from all levels, especially when we talk about visible learning and thinking and these types of strategies that we know are so important for students in scaffolding and modeling. And it's going to be about that human amplification. So we need to talk about how we build those relationships and how we are working with our learners around the globe to make sure we're staying true to that. Do we have any questions in our chat?
Not right now, but we do have 3 more minutes. So if anyone has a burning question that they want to get into the questions tab by any means, we've been watching this whole time. It sounds like you all have been very attentive listeners, so thank you for that. But if you have any questions for us, please do feel free to drop them into the questions tab. And if you can't see that, it's just across the very top of your screen. It says Q&A. It has a little question mark on it. You're welcome to use that. And I think we'll work on getting some kind of chat turned on for our afternoon version of this session. But thank you all for your time. Like Jerry said, your time is really important. Hopefully this has given you some interesting resources, some things to think about. And we'll hang on for a couple of minutes. But if we don't see you or hear from you, thank you again for coming in, for entertaining these ideas, for engaging in this conversation globally. We think it's really important, and it was a real privilege to share it with you.